Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 12, Part 1. This is going to be a high-end water-cooled build built into the Corsair Obsidian 900D. Now I'm going to do this build log a little bit differently. I'm going to be using components from the client's previous build. And this is something that I often do, but usually the client will just send me a few components from the previous build. In this case, the client has sent me the entire old build. So I'm going to start this build log by removing all of the components from the old build that I need for the new build. So as you can see, the case is the Thermaltake Level 10 GT, and what I'm going to be removing from this system is the CPU, which is the Intel Core i7-3960X, the two graphics cards, which are Gigabyte GTX 680s, the optical drive, a hard drive, and also an SSD. We'll take a look at those components shortly. So I've now removed all of the components from the old build, and you can also see I have some new components here. I have an ASRock X79 Extreme 11 and a couple of Galaxy GTX 680s. Now these have also been sent to me by the client. So this build is going to have quad SLI GTX 680s, but what I'm going to do now is start testing all of these components, in particular the second-hand components. I'll usually test new components anyway, just to make sure they're not DOA, because if you're going to go to the trouble of building a high-end water-cooled system, you don't want to have any faulty components. You're a lot better off testing them beforehand, just in case. I've now completed the testing of all four of the graphics cards, so the two Gigabyte GTX 680s and the two Galaxy GTX 680s, and I'm about to install water blocks onto them. The water blocks I'm using in this build are EK Nickel Plexi CSQ. I'm also going to install CSQ backplates onto these graphics cards. So I've now installed the water blocks and backplates. And previously I've talked a lot about what I think about the EK CSQ design. You have a number of different design options for GTX 680 water blocks. And there's actually a GTX 680 block with the old EK design from before CSQ. And this is definitely my personal favorite GTX 680 block, because not only is it an amazing looking water block, it gives you complete freedom when it comes to multi-GPU water cooling configs. You can use any components you want between the graphics card water blocks, whereas with these water blocks, you really push towards using the EKFC bridge. You can use other components, if you use a massive amount of 90-degree fittings, but these water blocks are designed for the EKFC bridge, and that's what I'm going to be using in this build. We'll take a look at the bridge I'm using coming up later in the build log. So now for a look at the backs of the graphics cards, and I always prefer a backplate compared to a bare PCB. Obviously, it's a great way of cleaning up a build. Now for a brief overview of most of the components that are going into the build. I'm still waiting for some of the components to arrive. So we've already taken a look at the graphics cards. The motherboard is the ASRock X79 Extreme 11. I have 32 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance memory, a Seasonic X1250, and this is the optical drive from the old build. The case, as I've mentioned, is the Corsair Obsidian 900D. All of the water blocks I'm using in this build, as I've mentioned, are EK Nickel Plexi CSQ. So obviously I have the four GTX 680 water blocks. I have two EK Coolstream XTX 480mm radiators, two sets of EK RAM Monarch modules, and two water blocks for the memory. Now these are the X2 memory water blocks. I actually need the X4 water blocks for this build. These water blocks are for another build that I'm currently doing. I have two EK D5 pumps to go with them, a couple of EK D5 XRes 140s, and I also have longer reservoir tubes for the XRes 140s. I have an EK FC bridge quad semi-parallel, and finally an EK Supremacy. Now there's a couple of components that I missed here. I also have the hard drive from the old build and the SSD from the old build, and I'll cover the rest of the components as they arrive. I'm now going to prepare the memory ready to be installed into the build. Before I do, just a brief look at these components. Now I actually have a 16 gigabyte kit of memory in two 8 gig sticks and two separate 8 gig sticks. They all run at 1600 MHz, 1027 1.5 volts, but this is not a matched 32 gigabyte kit of memory. And it is important to have a matched kit. It is going to be more stable. You're going to be able to overclock it further. And sometimes you'll find that your memory will not run at its rated speeds if it's not a matched kit. Now I have the EK Monarch X2 memory water blocks here, and as I mentioned, these are for another build, but I wanted to try them in this build to see if they would fit. You'll see what I mean shortly. I'm now going to take you through the installation of the EK Monarch module adapters. This is an excellent system because it allows you to install EK memory water blocks onto any memory as long as you can remove the stock heatsinks. So they're a great looking heatsink, and really they could be used on their own, but they are designed to have a memory water block installed on top. So it's just 2 bolts to bolt down the memory water block, and there's 3 bolts across the top to hold the 2 sides of the Monarch module adapters together. They're all black, so they're going to blend in nicely with any system, and they're nice and thick and solid, so it's going to allow for excellent heat transfer. The first thing I'm doing here is cutting through the sticker at the top of the stock heatsinks on the Corsair Vengeance memory, because this is actually the only thing holding the 2 sides of the stock heatsink together. Now, the thermal interface material used on most memory is like glue, so you're probably going to need a heat gun to remove the heatsinks. Don't apply too much pressure because you could damage the memory modules. Make sure you put even pressure across them. So I've now removed all of the stock heatsinks, and I'm using ArctiClean to remove the excess thermal interface material. And it was extremely difficult to remove from this memory. That was actually the most time-consuming part, was removing all of the excess TIM. And I've now installed thermal pads on all of the memory modules. Now before I installed the thermal pads, I put down some thermal paste so that the thermal pads would stick. And I've now placed the Monarch module adapter heatsinks in position, and I'm tightening the 3 bolts. Now don't over tighten them. Once they get to a certain point, the 2 sides of the heatsink actually come together, so only a certain amount of pressure will go onto the memory module. So the first installation is complete. I'm going to actually come back to the memory later. I'm now going to move on to some of the other components. I'm now going to assemble the pump and reservoir configurations. These configs are going to consist entirely of EK components. Even the pump is the EK version of the Lang D5. You have a couple of different options with the EK version now. You have this speed controlled version with an RPM readout, and there's also a PWM version now. This is the EK D5 X-Res 140. So it's basically a pump top with an inbuilt reservoir. And it comes with a 140mm reservoir tube, but you do have a number of different options for reservoir tubes that you can purchase separately. The pump top is extremely big and bulky. It's also heavy. It could be a lot more streamlined than this, a lot smaller and lighter, and despite how big and bulky it is, the inlet and outlet options are fairly limited. There's 2 outlets and a single inlet. And the real problem is, in terms of tubing routing, you cannot route your tubing back to the top of the res. This is the 200mm reservoir, and I really like that the thread is on the outside of the res. This is going to mean that the res tube is a lot stronger. So I've now completed the assembly of both of the pump and res configs, and they are a great looking config, mainly with a longer reservoir tube. But now that they're fully assembled, they are incredibly heavy, and you can see that the pump top is even bigger now because there's actually 2 sides of the pump top that comes together to hold the pump in position. And it is very big and bulky, and you also don't have the option of the cover that covers the back of the pump like you do with the Bits Power config. But this mount is excellent because you have anti-vibration rubber between the mount and the pump top, and it's going to allow easy installation into your build. Now for a brief look at the ASRock X79 Extreme 11. This is an incredible board, and I have been wanting to review it, but it's been out for a while now, so I'm just going to give you a quick look around at the main features. So it has 2 8-pin EPS and a 24+2 phase power design. It can take up to 64 gigabytes of quad channel 2500 MHz DDR3. It has 14 SATA ports. and 10 of them are SATA 3, 4 of them are SATA 2. Now 2 of the SATA 3 ports run off the X79 chipset and 4 of them run off an inbuilt LSI RAID controller. This motherboard has high-end, high-quality built-in audio, and really the most exciting feature is the PCIe bandwidth on this motherboard because it has 2 PLX chips. So a couple of the configurations you can run, there's actually 7 PCI Express 3 slots. So you can run a single slot at times 16 and the rest all at times 8. You can also run 4 discrete graphics cards all at times 16 PCI Express 3 bandwidth, which is just incredible. So this board has excellent connectivity, including dual gigabit LAN. Now I've had a few people asking me if I'm going to be installing water blocks onto this motherboard. Now there's currently no water blocks for this motherboard, although there is somebody making custom water blocks including for this board, and he does do an excellent job. But I'm sure that the stock cooling on this board is sufficient. It is something I'm going to be testing coming up. I mean, it has a 24+2 phase power design, so the power delivery components are not going to be overworked even under heavy overclocks. And you know, the chipset never really gets hot on X79 motherboards, obviously because of the architecture. I am concerned that the fan is going to be loud on the stock cooling, but there will no doubt be fan profiles for this fan. I've now installed the CPU and memory and also the CPU and memory water blocks. As you can see, I've installed the X4 memory blocks, and I mentioned that I was going to attempt to install the X2 blocks. The whole reason I'm doing this is because I've had a lot of comments every time I've installed the X4 memory blocks in this configuration. People say that they look too wide and that I should install the memory block that's designed for this config. So they're referring to the X2 memory water block. But the X2 memory water block is about 2 to 3 millimeters too narrow for this config because it's designed for 2 memory modules installed side by side. And in this config I have 2 memory modules installed 1 slot apart. So for this config you have to move up to the X4 memory water block. I'm now going back to the graphics cards to install the EKFC bridge. As I've mentioned, the EKFC bridge is really the only option for this particular water block design, unless you want to go installing a whole bunch of 90-degree fittings, which in my opinion just looks crowded and cluttered. But it is an excellent option. It's a great component. One of the main benefits you get from this component is strength, because it turns all of the graphics cards into a single unit, and you can then install and uninstall all of the graphics cards at the same time. And mainly when you have a whole lot of graphics cards like this, quad SLI, the increase in strength is definitely beneficial. It takes a lot of pressure off the PCIe slots off the motherboard. Now, this EKFC bridge has an interesting design because it is a parallel bridge, but it's a semi-parallel bridge. And if you take a look at the internals, you can see that the flow is split on one side. Now, if it was completely parallel, the flow would not be split. You'd have 2 tubes going down either side and the 4 inlets and outlets. Now, I want you to put in the comments why you think EK has gone for this particular design. Why have they split the flow like this and gone for a semi-parallel bridge instead of a full parallel bridge? Now for a brief look at the Corsair Obsidian 900D. Now, if I can find the time, I would definitely like to review this case. Instead of covering the specifications and features, I'm going to briefly talk about my opinion of this case. Now, it's an excellent case. It has everything you could dream of for a high-end water-cooled build. And somewhere where a lot of the competition is lacking is radiator capacity. And this case has excellent radiator capacity. I mean, I'm going to be installing 2 480mm and a 240mm radiator. It can take 3 480s, 1 in the top and 2 in the bottom. It can also take a 360 in the front. It has a massive amount of 3.5 inch and 2.5 inch and 5.25 inch bays. It can take up to a HPTX motherboard, dual power supplies, a massive amount of fans. It has excellent cable routing. But there is somewhere this case is lacking, and that is quality. And I'm not so much talking about the quality of the materials, I'm talking about the quality of the design. The top panel, for example, it's very thin and flimsy. It's difficult to remove and put back into position. And when you remove it, it flexes out of shape and you have to push it back into shape to get it back into position. And you know, the bottom two panels that fold out, I found that the hinges are very weak. They bend very easily. That happened almost, or started to happen almost straight away. It's very difficult to avoid. So there is a lot of design aspects of this case that are weak, but I can understand that because the design is fairly ambitious, but it just doesn't really stand up to the reputation. It's more of an older reputation that Corsair has for quality. You know, the Corsair Obsidian 800D was a highly anticipated case. So many people used it. I used it in a number of builds. You know, there's so many 800D mods. There's still people using that case. I do still think this case is definitely a worthy successor to that case though, just because of its all-out overkill design. I've now installed the motherboard and everything onto it, including the graphics cards. Now when you install graphics cards with an EKFC bridge, you need to loosen all of the bolts so that the graphics cards can properly align and sit properly in the slots, and you really need to do this while the motherboard is horizontal. I'm now going to move on to installing the radiators, and before I do, I need to flush them. You always need to flush radiators before installing them, even if they're new. The technique I use for flushing new radiators is just to fill them up with water, shake it up and empty it out. And what you actually need to do is fill the radiator up, tip it up on its end. Mainly with larger capacity radiators, you'll hear all of the water flowing down. Wait until it settles and then tip the radiator up the other way and continue doing the same thing. And you do this, you know, a lot of times before you empty it out. Now, I empty out the water onto a white surface so that I can see what's coming out. Usually it's black particles, so I'll continue flushing the radiator until what's coming out is clean. And I'll start with tap water because often I go through liters of water, and then I'll move on to distilled or deionized water for the final few flushes. These are great looking radiators. These are EK Coolstream XTX 480mm radiators. And I'm going to be installing 2 of these into the build and also an XTX 240 which hasn't yet arrived. So they're 64mm thick and they have an 11 FPI. They have M3 threads. They have an inlet and outlet on both sides of the radiator and also a drain port on one end. The end tanks are nice and small and compact. We have these EK logos printed on either side and also on the end. And all round they're a great looking radiator for a quiet configuration. Obviously with this fin array you can install low RPM silent fans, and with how thick these radiators are, the performance is going to be excellent. The fans I'm using in this build for radiator fans and case fans are Noiseblocker Black Silent Pro PL2s. I often use these fans in my builds. The specifications are 1400 RPM, 1.24mm H2O, 56.5 CFM and 22.5 decibels. I've finished flushing the radiators and I've now installed the radiators and fans into the build. So the configuration I've gone for in the lower compartment, I've installed the radiator onto this side of the case and I've installed the fans in a push configuration. I've used M3 30mm socket head Allen key bolts, and I've also used M3 washers. Now this radiator almost takes up this entire half of the case. There'd only just be enough space for a push-pull configuration with a radiator of this thickness. On the other side of the lower compartment, I'm going to install the EK Coolstream XTX 240 and the power supply. And there will just be enough room for that configuration with custom cables. Now you can see that the drain port is at the front of the build, and there might just be enough room to hook up a bits power tap to that drain port. It might just work out perfectly. I had to remove the fan at the front at the bottom of the case because there just wasn't enough room for it. So now looking at the top radiator, I've used M3 button head Allen key bolts. They're actually 6mm bolts. And there is plenty of room up here for a 480mm radiator in this case. You know, even a radiator of this thickness, and there would still be enough room for a push-pull configuration, which is just excellent. And you know, you can put the inlet and outlet up either end. There is just so much freedom in this case when it comes to radiator capacity and different radiator configurations. It's now time for me to start tubing up, and in this build I'm going to do something different with the tubing. For a long time before I built Nighthawk, which was client build 5, I wanted to use acrylic tube in a build, but back then the only real option was Bitspower Crystal Link, which was 10mm internal diameter and 12mm external diameter. So what was holding me back from using it was the small diameter. I knew that it wouldn't really have an effect on performance, but I knew that it would look unusual, and I thought that other people weren't really going to like it, because back then most people were using 1/2 inch soft tubing. But in Nighthawk I didn't have a choice, because I had so many water blocks in such close vicinity. It was the first X79 build where I was using memory water blocks, motherboard water blocks, CPU water block, graphics card water blocks. So I think it was 7 blocks in close vicinity, and the only way I could tube them up was with acrylic tube. So I went ahead and used it, and you know, it turns out that people liked it. I'm not going to take the credit for the acrylic tube trend, but it was around that time that everybody started using it. And since then, Primo Chill has come out with a larger diameter acrylic tube, and now EK has also come out with an even larger diameter acrylic tube, and that's what I'm going to use in this build. And this is what I always wanted. For years I've been wanting an acrylic tube system of this diameter, and I actually wanted it so much that long before Nighthawk I was actually thinking about manufacturing an acrylic tube system of my own. But at last I can use, you know, a massive diameter acrylic tube in a build. And the actual diameter of this acrylic tube, the internal diameter is the same as the external diameter of Bitspower Crystal Link. So it's 12mm internal, 16mm external. And I'm going to be bending the acrylic tube throughout this loop. So at the start of the next part of the build log, I'm going to take you through cutting and bending acrylic tube and give you a good look around this new acrylic tube system. So that sums up this part of the build log. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.